Before the wedding was over, she tried to have me removed, not because I caused a scene, not because I was drunk, but because she believed I was nothing more than a failed woman, unworthy of standing in the same room as her family. The interesting thing was, she said it directly in front of me, and had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. Women like you never amount to anything. She said it just quietly enough for others to pretend they hadn't heard, but just loudly enough for me to catch every single word. I was standing less than a meter away from her, a glass of ice water in my hand, a lavish wedding behind my back, and a secret that, had she known it, she probably never would have opened her mouth. I could have turned around, could have told her exactly who I was, could have mentioned that I served in the United States Army for nearly 2 decades, that I commanded missions whose files are still sealed, that I made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people. I could have done all of that, but I didn't. Because experience had taught me one thing. When someone publicly underestimates you, don't interrupt them. Let them keep going. Let them build the stage themselves, light the lights themselves, invite the audience themselves. Then when the truth arrives, everyone will remember exactly who it was that made a fool of themselves. My name is Mara. I spent 19 years in the United States Army. I became a lieutenant colonel before I turned 41. I have sat in rooms where the decisions being made would stay classified for 30 years after my death. I have been the calmest person in spaces where calmness was the only thing keeping people alive. And the weekend this happened, I was standing in a riverside venue in Savannah, Georgia, wearing a dark blue dress I'd bought specifically because it didn't scream military, drinking ice water instead of champagne, because I'd taken ibuprofen 40 minutes earlier for the knee that stopped being fully cooperative after a bad landing in Afghanistan 3 years prior. That part never makes it into the recruitment material. The venue was a renovated cotton warehouse on the waterfront. The Savannah River stretched wide and black just beyond the open French doors, and somebody had spent serious money on white orchids, Edison bulb lighting suspended between the original timber beams, and linen tablecloths that looked like they'd been ironed by someone who cared about their work. My place card said, Mara Jennings. No rank, no designation, no +1. I'd requested it exactly that way. I'd learned years ago that putting my rank in front of my name at family events made people act strangely. Either they went stiff and formal, or they cracked jokes about me giving orders at the dinner table. I was tired of both options. Honestly, I was just tired. Not dramatically tired. The quiet kind. The kind that builds over years in that specific way you don't explain to people because they either already know it or they wouldn't understand it anyway. My brother Kyle was across the room, arm around his new wife Daniela, laughing at something her father had said. Kyle was 38, 3 years younger than me, broad-shouldered and easy with people the way I'd never quite been. He ran a landscaping company outside Columbus that had his name on the trucks. When he'd spotted me earlier, he grabbed me into a hug and said he was glad I'd made it. Then the wedding coordinator had pulled him in the other direction. That was about an hour before I ended up at that bar. The woman who said it was named Brooke. She was Daniela's maid of honor, close friend since college. The kind of close that means she knew Daniela's family stories and had strong opinions about the wedding menu, and smiled at me in that bright, measuring way that told me she'd already decided everything important about me within the first 20 seconds. She was standing behind me with another woman, wine glasses in hand, just close enough. She's got that look, Brooke said. A soft diagnostic voice. Pretty enough to get invited somewhere nice. Not actually significant enough to be introduced properly. The bartender young guy, crooked bow tie, the honest face of someone who wishes he'd taken the weekend off, glanced at me. He had heard it. I gave him the kind of smile that says let it go. He mixed someone else's drink. Brooke kept going. Because people like her always do once they start. I heard she's military or something. You know the type. That whole vibe like they're waiting for someone to recognize them for a sacrifice nobody remembers. I breathed through my nose. I adjusted my grip on the water glass. I kept my face the way I'd learned to keep it in rooms where everything depended on my face not moving. And here's what I want to be honest with you about. Part of me, a large part, wanted to let it go. I was tired. It was my brother's wedding weekend. I'd flown from Fort Bragg with a bag I'd packed in 20 minutes and a knee that had ached the whole flight. I just wanted to get through 2 days without incident, say something genuine at the toast, and get back to my hotel room at a reasonable hour. But there was another part of me. Quieter, older, more done. The part that had been swallowing things in rooms like this for 2 decades. The part that had held its opinions during holiday dinners, absorbed the assumptions of people who didn't know what I did and didn't ask, and smiled through 100 small moments that no one ever knew were costing me anything. That part had started running low. I didn't turn around. Not yet. Near the head table, I noticed a man I hadn't properly registered before. Older, mid to late 60s, white hair cropped close, posture that never fully left the service even when the uniform did. The kind of man who carries rank in his shoulders long after retirement. His name was General Warren Aldcroft. He was Daniela's uncle by marriage, and I hadn't known that until about 20 minutes before the rehearsal dinner started. I'd seen his name twice in official channels. Both times in connection with a mission I still didn't let myself think about in detail. He was mid-conversation with two men in dress blazers when his eyes moved across the room. And stopped. On me. His expression shifted into something careful and precise. The way faces go when the mind is doing rapid arithmetic and arriving somewhere unexpected. He said something brief to the men beside him. Then he walked directly toward me. My stomach tightened. Not in the way it had tightened when Brooke was talking. This was different. This was the specific feeling of something unresolved, walking toward you in a social setting where you don't have your professional armor on. He stopped a few feet away. Not smiling yet. Lieutenant Colonel Jennings. The sound drained from the room slowly. Not all at once, table by table, the way water finds a crack. The string quartet in the far corner kept playing something gentle and expensive. But everything else tilted toward that moment like a compass to north. Brooke went quiet behind me. I turned fully. General Aldcroft. Something moved through his face that men like him don't usually let through in public. Relief, maybe, or the weight of a debt he'd been carrying that had just unexpectedly arrived at the same address as gratitude. "I'll be damned," he said, quietly. Then he turned slightly, just enough that the people who had drifted close enough to witness could hear him clearly, and said in a voice calibrated with the precision of a man who has given thousands of orders in his life, "This woman helped bring my son home. I want you to understand what that moment actually felt like. Because in every story people tell afterward, it sounds clean. Like justice arriving on schedule with appropriate music. Real life doesn't work that way. What I felt was not triumph. What I felt was a kind of deep, specific exhaustion, the kind you feel when you realize that recognition only reached you because someone important said your name first. And if he hadn't been in that room, you'd still be invisible. That feeling is harder to sit with than the insult. Nobody moved for several seconds. Brooke's face had lost all its color. Kyle had made his way across the room by then, reading the situation in that particular way he'd had since childhood, quietly calculating how out of his depth he was. "You two know each other?" he asked, looking between us. "Know her?" General Aldcroft said. The words were measured, not unkind, but they landed like a correction. "Your sister was the officer in command when my son Lucas was extracted from an active engagement zone overseas 3 years ago." He looked at Kyle steadily. "Why was I not told she was part of your family?" Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. "She doesn't really talk about work." "No," I said, "I don't. What I didn't say, what I would never say in the middle of someone's rehearsal dinner, was that I didn't talk about it because nobody had ever properly asked." Kyle knew I wore a uniform. He knew I was somewhere overseas when I missed his 40th birthday party. He knew I existed in a general category called military, that people treat like a complicated medical diagnosis. They nod and redirect because they don't know what to ask and they're vaguely afraid of what they might learn. That was the whole biography he'd assembled for me. I'd let him keep it, because asking for more had stopped feeling worth the effort somewhere around year 12. We moved to the dinner tables not long after. General Aldcroft requested I sit near him, and I watched Daniela quietly redirect place cards, while Brooke, repositioned near the champagne station, worked at keeping her expression pleasant. She was good at it. I'll give her that. Dinner was low country boil. Shrimp, andouille, corn, all piled on butcher paper in the center of the table. Savannah food. Real food. The kind that forgives you for being dressed up. I ate most of mine and listened to people discuss mortgage rates, hurricane prep, whether someone's cousin had made a mistake moving to Arizona. Normal American wedding conversation, the kind I used to miss fiercely during long overseas stretches. The kind that now made me feel like I'd stepped off a long flight into a country whose language I once spoke fluently and couldn't quite locate anymore. After dinner, I went inside to use the restroom. On my way back down a hallway, I heard Brooke's voice through a partially open side door. "She walks in here like she belongs on a magazine cover," Brooke was saying, voice low and edged. And now everyone's acting like she's a war hero because some old man recognized her name. A muffled response from someone else. Brooke laughed, quiet and cutting. Please. If she was genuinely that important, her own family would have said something about her a long time ago. I stopped, hand flat against the wall. That one hit differently than the bar comment. Not because it was crueler, because it was standing at the border of something true. If I was so significant, why had I spent the entire weekend being optional inside a room full of people who shared my last name? Why did recognition have to arrive through a retired general's voice rather than my brother's? I stood there for a long moment with the river sounds coming in from outside boats, water against the dock, somebody laughing on a deck somewhere, and I thought about that. Then I straightened, took one slow breath, walked back toward the light. The next morning it rained. That particular Savannah rain that doesn't insist on itself just settles in, soft and gray, like it's got nowhere better to be. I was awake before 5:30. 19 years of formations will do that to your body permanently. Doesn't matter how exhausted you are, or how long the night before went, or how much you need more sleep. Your internal clock still assumes someone important might need you before sunrise. My knee ached when I swung my legs off the edge of the bed. I sat there rubbing the joint through my sweatpants while the hotel air conditioning rattled, and a child somewhere down the hall laughed at something on a screen. Normal hotel morning sounds. I've woken up in enough hotels across enough time zones to know those sounds by heart. I texted Priya. She'd checked in the night before. Still standing, I wrote. Her reply came back fast. That bad? I thought about how to answer. You know that thing where a room decides who you are before you've said a word? 3 dots appeared on the screen. Then, yeah, usually means they're scared of something they can't name. I sat with that longer than I expected. Brunch was at Daniela's aunt's estate about 15 minutes from the river, a proper southern home with a wraparound porch, wisteria climbing the columns, and ceiling fans turning slow overhead like the whole day had agreed there was no hurry. The rain had stopped by then, and the air smelled like wet hydrangeas and warm earth. When I walked in, conversations paused. Just briefly. Just enough. Brooke was near the kitchen island arranging a fruit tray that absolutely did not need arranging. She wore cream linen and a pearl necklace and said, Mara, so glad you made it. Smiling with her whole face, performing warmth the way performers perform calm. Kyle handed me coffee. Black. No sugar. Still right after all these years. That small thing hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting. He watched me with the particular nervous energy of someone waiting for the weather to break while pretending they aren't. General Aldcroft arrived 20 minutes later, and the atmosphere shifted the way atmospheres do around people who've spent careers being the gravitational center of rooms. He found me near the porch railing and we talked easily, actually about old bases, about what readjustment feels like after long service, about how his knees bothered him every single morning without apology. The retired colonel beside him, a man named Mercer, with arthritis-swollen knuckles and hearing aids in both ears, leaned over at one point and said quietly, I read about the extraction near Karma, 3 years back. My stomach tightened. He nodded once. No patriotic speech. No hand on the shoulder. Just understanding, plain and direct. That nearly undid me more than any of Brooke's comments. Because there is something specifically exhausting about being understood by strangers more completely than your own family without being asked. Brooke, sensing the weight of the conversations happening without her, began dropping her comments sideways, lower, sharper. Inside, while I refilled my coffee, she said to 2 women from Daniela's college years, Some people make their rank their entire personality. I just think that's a little sad. Life is bigger than what you do. I turned from the coffee pot. Honestly, if that were me 10 years ago, I probably would have swallowed it, added it to the collection, smiled and changed rooms. But I was 42 years old, and something in me had simply stopped doing that. Funny, I said. I've noticed people only say that about women. One of the women bit back a laugh before she could stop herself. Brooke's smile froze, precise and brittle. I just mean balance matters, she said. Lighter now, giving herself room. Sure, I said. So does knowing someone before you decide what they are. She had no clean answer for that. Small victory. Didn't feel like one. Victories like that rarely do. The evening reception arrived with clearing skies and warm October air that had no business being that kind. The wedding proper had been the day before, so this was the longer second celebration. Dinner, toasts, dancing, the whole slow unraveling into night. The band was mid-set when a retired colonel, 3 bourbons in voice, carrying across the outdoor porch like he was still calling formations, announced to no one in particular. Lieutenant Colonel Jennings. You giving the toast tonight or what? Every head in the immediate vicinity turned. Every head. Brooke's champagne glass paused mid-air. Kyle looked at me with the expression of a man watching a controlled detonation that he is suddenly not sure is actually controlled. General Aldcroft met my eyes from across the table. He didn't speak. He was giving me a choice. And he knew it. And I knew it. That mattered. I could walk away clean. I could keep my head down. Let the weekend dissolve quietly into a story I told Priya over the phone on the drive back to the base, both of us half laughing about how strange families are. I had done that before. I had done that for years. Made myself smaller in rooms where I belonged so nobody else would have to feel uncomfortable. The tired part of me said, just go. Just go. But there was another part, older, done. I handed the bartender my empty coffee cup and said, yeah, I think I will. Brooke set her glass down on the table. The microphone was heavier than expected. My palm was damp. Somebody's toddler was crying near the edge of the tent because he'd dropped a cookie. And that small, ordinary sound helped. It kept me tethered to the room, to the actual moment, rather than the version of it happening inside my head. The band lowered their instruments. Conversation softened, table by table, until the whole tent was waiting. I cleared my throat. Okay, I said, adjusting the microphone. Fair warning, I'm significantly better at briefings than speeches, and even those usually make people wish they'd stayed home. A real laugh moved through the room. Real, not polite. The room exhaled slightly. I looked at Kyle. My brother, 38 years old, gray just starting at his temples, hands rough from a decade of outdoor work, a brand new wedding ring still catching the light with that particular shine that fades after 6 months. For one strange compressed second, I saw him at 10 years old, sitting on the floor of our parents' house in Columbus building a plastic model airplane, while our father argued with our mother in the kitchen about a bill that was 30 days overdue and wasn't going to get paid this week, or maybe next. Memory does that when it wants to reach you. It ignores the years and goes straight for the kid. I'm genuinely happy for Kyle and Daniela, I said, and I meant every syllable of it. Daniela smiled. Kyle nodded once. People who spend time around the military, I continued, get used to a very specific image of what strength looks like. It looks loud. It looks certain. It looks like it was never scared. I paused. Most of it's wrong. The bravest people I've known were terrified. They were exhausted. They kept going anyway because someone else was depending on them to. An older veteran near the back of the tent lowered his eyes. The truth is that nobody gets through this life alone. Not in the military, not in a family, not anywhere. I let that sit for a moment. Then I took a slow breath, because here was the part I hadn't planned. The part that had been building since Friday night. A few years ago, someone I love called me at 2 a.m. Kyle went completely still. He sounded steady at first. Casual. The way people sound when they've already run every other calculation and come up empty, so they're trying to make the last option sound smaller than it is. I felt the room listening, not politely, actually. His business was in real trouble. He had employees who needed their paychecks on Friday. The bank had frozen his line of credit after a rough stretch, and he had held on alone as long as he could, before finally calling the one person he thought might be able to help. I paused. I was in a hotel outside Raleigh. I had been in a 14-hour briefing cycle, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed eating vending machine crackers. I wired him the money before I went to sleep. Nothing moved in the tent. No ambient noise, no chair shifting. Even the distant boat sounds on the river seemed to recede. I didn't tell anyone, I said. Not because I wanted credit later. I didn't need credit. I needed him to pay his people and keep the thing he'd built. That mattered more than the money. I looked directly at Kyle now. My brother's face was already changing. But sometimes people get so ashamed of needing help that they start treating the person who helped them like a problem to solve rather than a person to know. Kyle pressed both hands over his face. Brooke turned slowly in her chair to look at him. Her expression was no longer managed. It was pure confusion with fear just behind it. General Aldcroft leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Daniela's hand found her husband's arm on the table. General Aldcroft spoke then, quiet, steady, precise as a field compass. Son, did your sister help save your company? Kyle took a long, slow breath that the whole room could hear. Yeah, he said. She did. Brooke stared at him. You never told me that. No. His voice was low. I didn't. Kyle. Her voice had risen slightly now. How much? His jaw worked. The words came out like something heavy he'd been holding in his chest for years. $42,000. The reaction moved through the tent in waves. A sharp intake of breath near the back. An older man muttering something that sounded like, of course she did. A woman pressing her hand to her mouth. A silence after that was nothing like the polite silence from before this, was the specific silence of a room full of people recalculating what they thought they knew. Brooke looked at me, and it was the first time all weekend that she was seeing a different person than the woman she'd decided I was at that bar. I watched it happen, watched the structure of her assumption come apart in real time. I spoke before the room could fully turn on her. I didn't say that to humiliate anyone, I said, and I meant it. Kyle paid his employees that Friday. His company survived. That outcome mattered more to me than acknowledgement. It still does. I met my brother's eyes. He was still covering his mouth with one hand, and the guilt on his face was almost too much to look at directly. I just got tired, I said, quieter now. I got tired of being invisible inside my own family. That's all. That's the whole thing. General Aldcroft stood then. He didn't raise his voice, men like him never need to. My son Lucas told me about her, he said. He said that when everything fell apart over there, when people started to panic, she was the one who didn't waste a single second on fear. He said she just kept making decisions. He looked around the tent, not theatrically, but with the directness of a man who means every word and knows the difference. I'd say it's worth knowing a person like that. Brooke stood abruptly. Her chair scraped back. Her voice cracked at the edges. So now I'm the villain, she said. To the table, to the room, to no one specifically. At my best friend's wedding? She looked around with the expression of someone who had expected the room to push back in her favor, and had just realized it wasn't going to. You all act like she's some kind of saint, because she wore a uniform. No, I said, quietly. She turned toward me. Fast. I held her gaze. You're not a villain, Brooke. She laughed, short and wounded. Sure feels like it right now. I took one slow breath. You were cruel to someone you decided was beneath you before you knew a single actual thing about them. I kept my voice even, not cold, just clear. That's not villainy. That's what people do when they're threatened by someone who doesn't fit the story they've been telling about how the world works. That landed. You could feel it land. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then she picked up her purse, and without looking at Daniela or Kyle or anyone else, she walked toward the exit with her heels unsteady on the grass. Daniela started to rise. Brooke shook her head once without turning around, and for a long moment the tent held the particular collective stillness of people who have just witnessed something true and are figuring out what to do with it. I set the microphone down carefully. My hands were trembling now, the kind of trembling that comes after, not during. The kind that means the discipline held. And here is what it cost. General Aldcroft passed me on his way back to his seat. He squeezed my shoulder once. Not dramatically. Not for the room. Just one person acknowledging another. That was enough. Kyle stayed in his chair for a long time after the room started moving again. When he finally looked up, something in his face had changed. It wasn't apology yet. It was something that comes before apology. The particular expression of someone who has been living in a comfortable lie, and has just had it taken away gently enough that they can feel how long it's been there. That hurt more than any of it. It hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I slept maybe 3 hours. Not because I felt proud. Not because I felt clean or vindicated or any of the things people imagine you feel after a moment like that. I lay in the hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and replayed every sentence, turning each one over, asking which parts were necessary and which parts were just old pain that had finally found a microphone. Around 5:30 I gave up, showered, pulled on jeans and a black pullover and the knee brace I hate wearing in public. I made coffee in the room's tiny machine that always smells faintly like burnt plastic. Then I sat on the edge of the bed in the gray Savannah morning and waited. Kyle's text came at 6:23. Can we talk before you leave? I stared at it for a while. Then I wrote back, lobby. 20 minutes. He was already there when I came downstairs. Looked rough, same slacks from the night before, wrinkled shirt, hair that had stopped trying. 2 paper cups on the table between us. An envelope tucked under his hand. We sat there for a full minute without speaking. Outside the hotel windows, the city was just beginning to wake up. An older couple argued softly over directions. A front desk printer jammed and beeped in an indignant rhythm. Kyle pushed a cup toward me. "Still black," he said. "Right?" I nodded. That small thing hit somewhere I didn't have good armor for anymore. He remembered how I took my coffee. He'd just forgotten so much of the rest. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know how to fix this. Start by not making me the villain for remembering it." He looked down. "Yeah." Another silence. Then he slid the envelope across the table. "Some of the gift money," he said. "It's not all of it. It's a start." He cleared his throat. "Daniela knows. She said I needed to begin somewhere. She was pretty upset. Not about the money exactly." He paused. "About the hiding." Good for Daniela, I thought. And I meant it genuinely. "Why did you let me stand alone in that room all weekend?" I asked. I wasn't asking to wound him. I just needed the real answer. He looked at the table for a long time. "I was ashamed," he said. "Not of needing help. Of needing you specifically." He exhaled. "You always figured things out. You always knew what to do. And then I needed you to come in and save something I'd built. And afterward I couldn't. I didn't know how to be grateful without feeling like I'd given something away." He looked up. "I think I turned it into resentment because resentment was easier than sitting with how much I owed you." His voice was steady. Tired, but steady. "When Dad got hurt," he said, "everyone looked at me like I was supposed to step up and be the man. You left and did something big and I stayed and tried to build something real. For a long time I told myself I chose it. That I was the one who showed up." He looked at his hands. "But I needed you to still need something from me, and you never seemed to." There it was. That was the whole thing, actually. Not Brooke, not the bar, not the remarks about rank. It was 20 years of two people who loved each other and never found a clean way to say it that didn't cost one of them something. "I need you to see me," I said. "That's what I need." He looked across the table. Really looked this time. Not calculating, not managing, just looking. "Okay," he said. One word. Plain. It felt solid. Not because it resolved everything it didn't, and we both knew it, but because he didn't dress it up. He just said it and let it be true. We sat in that hotel lobby drinking bad coffee while families shuffled past with rolling suitcases, and a small boy negotiated with the front desk clerk over a second hot chocolate. Normal, ordinary, relentless life, continuing in every direction regardless of what had happened the night before. I found I was grateful for it. For how indifferent the world is to your private reckonings. It leaves you space to just sit there and be two people deciding whether to start over. When I stood to leave, Kyle walked me out to the rental car. The air smelled like wet pavement and river mud and morning birds. He stood with his hands in his pockets, and for just a second he looked like a kid again. The kid who used to make me promise I was coming back from wherever I was going. "I missed you," he said. That was the one that almost broke me open. I put my bag in the trunk and closed it. "Then call before the next crisis," I said. He gave a small, ashamed laugh. "I will. And not just when something's wrong. Especially then," he said. We hugged. Not long, but real. The kind that means something precisely because it's brief. On the flight back to Fort Bragg, I had a window seat. The man beside me, a Korea veteran, cap and everything, arms folded across his chest, was asleep before we left the gate. Across the aisle, a grandmother rubbed swollen fingers and watched the clouds the way people watch things they've stopped needing answers from. I thought about how the people who have lived through the most difficult things usually carry it the quietest. Not because they're hiding, because they've learned. Slowly, and at some cost, which rooms are worth opening up in. I kept the envelope in my bag without counting it. The amount wasn't the point. The point was that Kyle had stopped pretending there was nothing to acknowledge. This story taught me something I keep returning to. The people who underestimate you aren't always your enemies. Sometimes they're just people who are scared of what it means if you matter, scared that someone unremarkable to them, without introductions or credentials or loud announcements, could turn out to mean more than the story they've already settled on about how the world works. Brooke couldn't process the general looking past her to acknowledge me, not because she was evil, but because it violated the entire framework she'd spent years learning to navigate. Broken frameworks cut sideways. That doesn't make the cuts okay. It just means carrying the understanding costs less than carrying the anger. What she could never quite say out loud was that she'd grown up adjacent to men who were respected in a very specific way, and had learned early that women only mattered in that world by standing beside those men, never among them. And here I was, a woman she'd dismissed in 30 seconds, being someone those men respected. That kind of realization breaks something in a person fast, and broken things cut sideways. Understanding that doesn't mean excusing it, but it means I'm not carrying it anymore. Here's the thing I'd ask you to take with you from this. Stop disappearing to keep other people comfortable. Every time you stay quiet in a room where you belong, you teach that room it was right about you. You don't owe anyone a smaller version of yourself to make the space feel less crowded. And sit with this one question if you're willing. Is there someone in your life not a stranger? Someone who should actually know you who doesn't yet? And what would it cost you to let them? If this story landed somewhere close for you, I want to hear from you. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think Mara should have stayed quiet and kept the peace. Drop a 2 if you think she handled it exactly right. Drop a 3 if you think she could have gone further. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing where these stories travel. And if you've ever had to prove yourself twice over just to be seen once by someone who was supposed to already know you, please share that story. Those are the ones I stay up late reading. If you're new here, this is what I do every week. Stories about real people carrying invisible things through ordinary moments. Hit subscribe so you're there for the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Savannah, Georgia to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.